Our next session is going to look at the role of the regulators, particularly in relation to financial risks of climate change. You probably know that just 2 months ago, APRA released the results of its first climate risk survey of banks, insurers and superannuation trustees. And following the results of that, it vowed to increase its scrutiny of how businesses are managing those risks. So now you'll hear from APRA, also ASIC, and get an investor perspective as well. So if I can ask our panel to come up as I introduce them. And I'm going to not really read the bios because they're all right in front of you on the table at length. Rosemary Kelly, a board director of First State Super. Rosemary chairs First State Super's investment committee. FSS has got more than 90 billion in funds under management. John Price, commissioner for ASIC. He's got 20 years of regulatory experience, including a variety of regulatory roles relating to policy making, fundraising, mergers and acquisitions, financial services and products, licensing, insolvency, reporting and audit. You are a busy man, no doubt getting busier. And Geoff Summerhayes, executive board member at APRA. His responsibilities at APRA include the oversight of the general life and private health insurance sector. And your moderator for this session is Kate Griffiths, executive manager of public policy and advocacy at ACSI. Please welcome your panel.
Thank you, everyone. And, I was just reflecting, it's just 10 o'clock and what a wonderful session already. There's so much to think about so early in the day. Turning to the topic of our session today, it does seem to me that climate change debate has picked up significant momentum over the last sort of year or even the last few months, with the upcoming election being dubbed the climate change election, Climate Action 100 picking up momentum, and even school kids around the world stepping up. Financial regulators are also increasingly making their voices heard. The Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a coalition of central banks and supervisors representing 5 continents and 44% of global GDP, has recently issued 6 recommendations for greening the financial system and managing environment and climate-related risks. As you heard Ali introduce, regulators in Australia are increasingly becoming more active. In September last year, ASIC released its climate risk disclosure by Australia's listed companies, and in March, APRA released its climate change awareness to action report. Investors too, they recognise the significant risks that climate change might pose to their portfolios. So thanks to our panel for joining us today. In terms of format, each panellist will spend a few minutes introducing us to their work, after which we'll have a discussion and there'll be an opportunity for questions from the floor. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rosemary, after which Geoff and John will make their opening remarks. Thanks, Rosemary.
Thanks, Kate. And I'm pleased to be here to put First State Super's point of view, but I think I speak for a lot of large superannuation funds in talking about response to climate change. So First State Super sees itself as a universal owner. We acknowledge that the size of our fund and the amount of FUM that we have makes us, like a lot of large super funds, have an enormous influence on markets. We have an influence on communities and we have an influence on the environment through the investment decisions that we make. Of course, climate change is obviously one of those factors in ESG, and we for a long time used ESG as a lens, a risk lens. And I'd like to acknowledge Ian's contribution in opening the conference, because he's really put everybody straight on the fact that ESG is front and centre for investors as part of our due diligence and as part of the way we look at our portfolio across all asset classes, and not just in our responsible investing choice that members have. In terms of First State Super's response to the climate change part of the E, in 2015, we did a year's study, an internal study on climate change, on technological advances in energy, looking at policy positions, looking at scenario analysis. And out of that huge piece of work, the board endorsed a climate change action plan for the fund in 2016. And that climate change action plan has got 3 pillars. The first is to analyse our portfolio across all asset classes to look at where our vulnerabilities are on climate change risk. So we're taking a risk lens to looking at climate change. We did a piece of work in 2018 which has identified where there are climate change vulnerabilities in the portfolio. We are now looking at how material those vulnerabilities are and what we can do in terms of the portfolios and each of the asset classes to mitigate the risks that we have identified. A second pillar is engagement with companies. So we engage directly with companies through our responsible investing team, companies such as AGL, for example, and Santos. So we engage in companies that are in the energy sector and which are high emitters. We also recognise that we can't do this work on our own. So the collaboration and cooperation between large asset owners and through our engagement through ACSI and in Australia and internationally through Hermes AOS is a very important part of our engagement. And also we are members of Climate Action 100, which came out of the PRI conference in Berlin, and that's an engagement where we're looking at the 100 plus biggest emitters on the planet and engaging with them about not only their own emissions and what they can do to mitigate that, but also the impact that those large emitters or those large companies have on the physical environment generally. So it's not just in relation to them themselves, but it's in relation to how they impact on the physical environment and therefore impact on the rest of our portfolio. So that's very much a part of our three-pronged attack. The third is to take the opportunities, and Ian talked about the threats, the risks, but also the opportunities that are there for investors in relation to climate change. So we're looking at investing in companies that are looking at, for example, efficiencies in energy use. Companies are looking at sustainable water, for example, and also investing directly in investments in renewable technologies such as wind, solar and hydro, for example. So taken together, that is the way that we're approaching the risks that climate change pose to our portfolio and taking the opportunity to look at the opportunities. The other thing I would say is that in terms of the regulators, I think APRA has taken the view that big and large asset owners like First State Super and other of the large super funds taking this ESG approach across their portfolios has been accepted by APRA, but it's not actually written into SPS 530 in terms of looking at the risks lens and applying a ESG risk lens across the total portfolio. So while APRA have looked at ethical investments and ethical investment options that our members might choose, they have yet to say that investors are able to use the lens across the whole portfolio of ESG and, of course, climate change. But B, I think there's even another step, and that is to say that investors must, so that superannuation funds should be looking at these climate risks and should be taking action. And of course that extends across the whole of the ESG lenses that we use.
Thanks, Rosemary. John, would you like to?
Thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to participate in this panel session. What I thought I'd do today is make some brief introductory remarks, but I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that will follow. So in the limited time for the introductory remarks, I just wanted to cover two key issues from my perspective. That is, what are ASIC's key priorities in terms of climate risk? And we set some of these out in a public report last year. And secondly, a couple of what I think are very relevant and very recent developments in this area that I think it's important for people to understand. So as many of you would be aware, ASIC's been actively engaged in the area of climate risk. And from our point of view, climate change is a foreseeable risk, so legally foreseeable risk, facing many listed companies in a range of different industries. And so our primary focus in relation to climate change really is as follows. Firstly, we're quite focused on encouraging strong and effective corporate governance. So we consider that the prudent and appropriate management of issues such as climate change, be it a risk or an opportunity, begins with the core fundamentals of corporate governance. That is, integrity, transparency, accountability, and acting for a proper purpose. Secondly, we're focused on disclosure. Now, where the law requires disclosure of climate risk, needless to say, it should be done in a way that's useful and relevant to the market. Investors need to be able to price climate risk into their investment decisions, and that can't be done without effective disclosure from companies. And beyond statutory disclosure, I think, and where climate risk is material, we're actively encouraging boards, directors and advisors to provide voluntary disclosure to the market. And we've suggested that the recommendations set out in the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is shortened to TCFD for obvious reasons, are the best place for directors and boards to start in terms of assessing what sort of information to disclose, and we've strongly encouraged entities with material climate risks to consider reporting under the TCFD. And indeed, I should note that the latest version of the ASX Corporate Governance Principles also encourages the use of the TCFD. Now, we would certainly acknowledge the role of investors and investor groups, such as ACSI, such as the people in this room, in promoting and pushing for higher standards in terms of both governance and disclosure of climate risk. And we consider that the role of investors has been critical in terms of what we've achieved to date. Now, turning to my point about recent developments in this area, first I want to mention that climate risk considerations in the preparations of an entity's financial statements, as opposed to narrative disclosures in ESGs or other reports. So I'm not sure whether everyone knows, but the Australian Accounting Standards Board released guidance late last year on climate-related disclosure and assessing financial statement materiality using one of their practice statements, which is Practice Statement 2. And they noted that the views of many investors on the importance of climate-related risks to their decision-making, and in that light stated that entities can no longer treat climate-related risks as merely a matter of corporate social responsibility. They advised entities to consider these risks also in the context of their financial statements. And we see this as an important development which further cements the reality that the risks of climate change can be distinctly financial in nature. Secondly, it's also worthwhile just noting the very recent update to a prominent legal opinion which was issued by Noel Hutley SC and Sebastian Hartford Davis in relation to directors' duties in climate change. Now, I've spoken about ASIC's views on the original opinion in the past, so I won't revisit that today, but I want to leave you with a very short quote from that updated opinion which might help frame the discussion of the panel and indeed some of the questions from the audience. The updated opinion stated, and I quote, "There has been a series of coordinated interventions by Australian regulators which will require in practice that increased attention be given to both the assessment and disclosure of climate risk. There has been acute interest in these issues from investor groups. There have been developments in the state of scientific knowledge. In our opinion, these matters elevate the standard of care that will be expected of a reasonable director. Company directors who consider climate change risks actively, disclose them properly, and respond appropriately will reduce exposure to liability. But as time passes, the benchmark is rising." Thank you.
And thanks, Kate, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you, and thank you to ACSI for the opportunity to talk with you this morning about climate risk. My responsibilities at APRA are to do with the insurance sector, and the insurance sector has been managing climate for centuries, since its existence. But the climate, as we have known it, is no longer stable. The climate is changing, and that introduces a whole new paradigm for both firms, regulators, and the broader community. So APRA in 2016 gave some consideration to this issue, and there were three main trigger points that caused us to make the statements we have done, and along with colleagues at ASIC and the Reserve Bank more recently. And those were the Paris Agreement, the second was TCFD, and the third was the fact that John has just referred to was the legal opinion from Hutley and Hartford Davis. And we've viewed those as very reliable signals, both policy and market signals, that this risk was materialising in a financial sense. And so we debated as a board, how should we, engage with our regulated flock on this issue. And we decided that we were learning about the risk, regulators were learning about the risk, the entities that we were supervising were learning about the risk. So we would start by a process of doing a series of speeches, and the first of those speeches was in February 2017, and we made a couple of statements in that speech. And first of those was that we viewed some climate risk, as distinctly financial in nature, and this was shifting the debate away from an ethical or a moral issue, and that it was distinctly financial in nature. We adopted the global lens around physical transition and liability risk, and spoke about each of those. And we also said that we view those risks as material, foreseeable and actionable now. And with that in mind, we had an expectation that firms would also start to engage with the risks. So over the last couple of years, we have continued to do a series of awareness building speeches within our own agency. We have had to, like this room and like the community more broadly, we've had to build the knowledge and awareness within APRA about the risk. We've engaged with scientists, with universities, academic bodies, think tanks, the CSIRO. We've engaged with many of your firms, with peer regulators. And we've built our knowledge and got more confident about this very difficult and challenging risk and how it's going to materialise. So domestically, we established a working group of the Council of Financial Regulators with my colleague John Price and Guy Debelle from the Reserve Bank are on, along with the Treasury representative, and we have coordinated our action from a regulatory standpoint around prudential matters, disclosure matters, and then, as Deputy Governor Debelle said more recently, the view of the Reserve Bank from a systemic economic point of view, where I think his powerful statement was that climate risk was needed to be distinguished from the cycle to the trend that was occurring with this. So Kate, more recently, and you referred to it and Ali referred to it in the introduction, we thought we'd do a stock take on what has happened over the last 2 years. So on the 20th of March this year, we released an information paper, which for those of you who you haven't seen, I commend to you. The paper's entitled Climate Change Awareness to Action. And I guess in the heading that is signalling our intent that we have spent 2 years helping to build awareness. We are now expecting firms to be actively managing the risk, and indeed the survey of the 38 largest super funds, insurers and banks showed that on many dimensions this in fact was occurring. We don't think there is need for new prudential standards. We think CPS 220 and SPS 220 provide adequate means to and incentive for firms to supervise the risk. TCFD provides an appropriate disclosure framework, although I do want to come back to in the discussion around taxonomy and modelling, scenario testing, stress testing, which is underdeveloped and is a significant gap, a data gap as it relates to managing the risks. And just to address the point that Rosemary made at the opening, thank you for that. You'll be aware that more recently, in recent days, we have announced the review of that guidance 530. It relates back to the stronger super standards in 2013. That's a long time ago now. A lot has happened in the intervening 6 years, and that guidance definitely needs to be updated.
Well, Thanks very much, and thanks to all the panellists for their insight. I think there's some similar themes in there that really confirm that we're moving well beyond denialism, which is great, and progressing towards action. And what we'll do is we will move to questions. I'm sure there's many from the floor. So if you do want to ask a question, just please put up your hand. Make sure you introduce yourself and your organisation. That would be great. In the meantime, I'm going to take advantage of my position as moderator and ask a couple of questions to start with. I guess I'm quite interested in the theme, which is, we're moving towards, from that awareness phase into, it's really time to do something about this. And when I think about Sharon's address, there is a sense of urgency, or there should be a sense of urgency around this matter. And I'm sure with your updates, your guidance, there'll be many people in the room who will like to engage in that consultation process. But what does that look like going forward for you? What does it look like in that move from awareness to action? What kind of regulatory actions do you see? How do you think about that? Maybe first, Geoff.
Yeah. So, APRA is engaging with your organisations on a regular basis. You can now expect that those conversations will include your approach to climate risk, and we want to understand how that risk is governed. We want to understand how it's built into your business plan and your strategy. We want to know what the mitigants are that you are putting in place, how you're disclosing that, how you're analysing that, as we would with any other risk. And so we will do that as it relates for the superannuation sector through the lens of SBS 220. We found in our survey, Kate, that indeed of the 38 largest firms that were involved in the survey, that a lot of progress in the last 2 years, off a very low base, might I say, but we found that awareness of the risk was almost universal across those 38 firms. The risk were viewed by as material now or indeed in the future. In fact, the superannuation sector, 40% of the respondents said they were material now, and another 40% said that they would be in the near term. Pleasingly, a number of people also identified the opportunities that flowed from a changing climate in terms of new products, ways to engage with the community and resilience measures, ways to promote being a better corporate citizen, opportunities for skilling and within their own organisations. Many firms are indeed focusing on their skills internally. The climate risk are being embedded into risk management frameworks and into discussions within the firms, and at least there is some initial analysis taking place and some disclosure, but those last two would be the most patchy, and I think they are the most challenging both domestically and globally, and that is because while we have TCFD as a framework, we don't have the scaffolding underneath that around taxonomy, around modelling, classifications, scenario testing, looking at the confluence of events. And this is an analytically very challenging risk to understand how it materialises, and firms are struggling with that, and I wouldn't say that regulators have the answers to that either.
And I'll come back to that, but perhaps, John, you can give us some insight as to...
Well, I just endorse Geoff's comments. I think that there is a recognition in the business community that action is important. So in our report that we issued last year, we cited some work from KPMG, which did a survey of Australian CEOs, 48% of whom cited environmental or climate change risk as a risk to their organisation's growth. So I think there is that recognition in business. From our work, we found that climate change disclosure, there was much more meaningful engagement with it within larger listed institutions, so ASX 100, ASX 200 listed companies. So I think there is still the smaller to medium enterprise end of the market where some work might be required. I'd also make the point that my own view is that the TCFD disclosure framework is fast becoming the de facto disclosure framework in Australia. So you have it mentioned in the ASX corporate governance principles, We've encouraged entities to use it, as has the AASB, the accounting standard regulator. APRA have made mention of it. And I think that level of consistency, perhaps across the market, will be important going forward because, as I said before, for investors, consistency of reporting so you can compare and understand where risks might be and where opportunities might be is pretty important.
And Rosemary, from the investor's perspective, is that something that you would agree with in terms of that?
Absolutely.
That
so, analysing investment risk through the lens of climate change requires you to have information from companies about their risk. So the TCFDs are very important. But if you're going to compare across companies or compare over time, then there needs to be some standards around how those risks are reported, those financial risks. So I think that refers back to Geoff's comment about the scaffolding underneath. And they need to be part of, obviously, the financial reporting, not just a side issue about reporting on climate change risk in the annual report. So definitely from the point of view of asset owners and investors, yes, we need to see that level of detail.
Yeah. And coming back to that point about the scaffolding or the underpinning data gap, what can we do about that? Any ideas about how we can bring that together?
So there's actually lots happening on this both domestically and internationally. So you mentioned the NGFS, Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a grouping of now 36 global reserve banks and supervisors, including our own Reserve Bank as a member of that body. One of their work streams is in fact on this, developing the taxonomy and the modelling and scenario testing around that. I chair a body called the Sustainable Insurance Forum, which is the insurance equivalent of the NGFS, a grouping globally of insurance regulators, and we are focused in this area. There's some good work happening in Australia. There's an organisation called the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, which came out of a UN environment-sponsored conference run last year with about 300 firms in it. There are certainly superannuation firms a member of that, banks, insurers, regulators are sitting there as observers, universities, CSIRO, modelling organisations. And one of the issues that they are tackling also is this, how do we get a common taxonomy around the economic impacts of climate? How do we improve our modelling capability? How do we build in better scenario testing? So this is about connecting the climate to the commercial impacts to the prudential concerns that would impact firms around physical, transitional or liability risks, and that is underdeveloped globally. And for a risk that is so all-pervasive, that is a concern, and I guess my point is that it requires a multidisciplinary activity. I think the view here in Australia is that we shouldn't necessarily wait for a global standard. We should get on and advance that case ourselves, and certainly there is good engagement by industry, regulators and academia in that process.
And I mean, it does seem like there's an awful amount of work to do in what might be quite a short amount of time. John, I'm interested in, you mentioned the new accounting guidance. How important is that, and how much influence do you think that will be? Maybe you can just sort of give some reflections on that.
Well, I think it's quite important because it goes to the question of whether or not you're looking at climate risk purely from a ESG perspective, or you're taking it into account as far as financial impacts on the companies go. And if you have a look at the AASB practice statement, it refers to potential implications of climate risks, including things like asset impairment, changes in the useful life of assets, changes in fair valuation of assets, potential provisions and contingent liabilities, and changes in expected credit losses for loans, just to raise a few. So I think, to me, the importance of that practice statement is really hammering home the potential financial impact of climate risk And I think that is becoming more appreciated amongst the business community as time goes on.
And I'm not an accountant by training, so forgive me, but I mean, it seems to me from that guidance that that's leading us towards the path of disclosure of more specific financial information, leading down towards, you know, contingent liability or even provision type disclosure. Is that what you see?
Well, if certainly if financial risks are material and they need to be disclosed in accounts, it sort of goes to that scaffolding point that we were discussing earlier. There is a very comprehensive framework of how financial disclosures need to be made. And so that does underpin the way that accounts are prepared in this country and indeed internationally.
And so do you think that that will sharpen the focus?
I do, yes.
Is that the sort of information that you think might be helpful from an investor's perspective?
Absolutely, particularly in the largest companies that we invest in, absolutely.
Well, lots of food for thought there. So I might go to the floor now. Just can't quite see. Is anyone? Question down the front here.
Michael Bray, KPMG. A question, I guess, for John in the first instance. John, in this area in relation to disclosure, how would you see the usefulness of integrated reporting as a tool to put these sort of risks in a strategic context?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And for those of you who might not be familiar, integrated reporting is a more holistic form of reporting than simply financial reporting, I'd put it that way. In Australia, following the collapse of HIH insurance, some aspects of integrated reporting were already built into our regulatory framework through what's called an operating and financial review that requires, amongst other things, companies to talk about strategy elements, risk elements in terms of their operation. And certainly from our perspective, that legal requirement on that sort of disclosure would certainly encompass climate risk and indeed various other sorts of risks. And we've made that point in our public report. So, you know, I do see a link between the two things.
Another question over here.
Hi, my name is Akash, I'm from HESTA. My question is, how do you see the interplay between the financial and economic risks that you've been touching on with the social aspects that Sharon spoke about this morning, in particular the just transition?
I'll have a go at that. I mean, APRA has taken a view that these risks are distinctly financial in nature, and I think some of the history around climate change risks, where it was seen as a moral, ethical, or purely environmental issue without financial consequence, were sort of, to some extent, unhelpful and delayed the facing into what was going on. But one of the tenets of the Network for Greening the Financial System is this group of central bankers, is that in the future there will not be sustainable finance and other finance. All finance will need to be sustainable. So there is this linking together that we will need to have a sustainable future. Our finance and every aspect of our society will need to have that lens embedded into it. So, yeah, perhaps that's circling back to saying that ESG considerations are paramount in terms of the lens by which you look through. And certainly a number of the work streams for the NGFS are about encouraging green finance, which at the moment is seen as a category, but ultimately could in fact, there could only be one form of finance, and that is green finance.
Well, I also think that superannuation funds as universal owners, as I said before, we're very cognisant of our footprint and our influence, not just on markets, but on communities and on the environment. So I think for large asset owners and superannuation funds in particular, particularly industry and public sector funds, who look at the effect that their decision making has on the members of their funds, and the communities in which they live and into which they retire, I think these issues around the impact of our investment on individuals, on families, on communities, on the environment are really important. That's not to say that we don't act, obviously, in the best financial interests of our members, taking into account risks, but where you have opportunities to make an investment which has a positive impact on communities, that's where we should go. That doesn't mean that we would choose an investment that's going to give us a lower return, but in the whole suite of investments that are open to us, we can take the opportunity to invest where we're going to make a difference to communities. And I think that's a very important point. We understand the moral imperatives, but obviously as superannuation funds, we look at this through the lens of sustainable returns to our members. We look at through the lens of making differences to communities, and in our due diligence, we can look at what the risk-adjusted rates of returns are going to be. We can make choices about investments, and many of the large funds amongst us are doing that and are making investments into renewable energy, for example. So if there's two types of investment which might generate the same risk-adjusted returns, we can look at what impacts our investments are going to have and choose the one that's going to have a positive impact on our members and the communities in which they live, work and retire.
Thanks.
Okay, just on that point, I mean, the largest global investors are a real big driving force on this. So the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, MSCI, this is at the forefront of their thinking, and I think just to reinforce the point that their environmental considerations or sustainability considerations are fundamental to a sustainable finance outcome.
Yes, I think that's true. And picking up that point, when we're talking to our active investment managers, ESG is something that we as an investor demand that they look at across their selection of equities in the portfolio. So that's another aspect, another way in which large funds can influence this debate.
Thanks. I think there was another question, was there?
Hi, Michael Salvatico from MSCI. There's been good discussion and support for the disclosure of corporations. What about the disclosure or standardisation of the disclosure for investors?
Yeah. Sorry, can you just repeat that last part of the question? I just missed it.
What considerations might be given to standardise the climate risk reporting for superannuation funds?
Oh, I see. So the extent to which they take into account those sort of issues in making their own investment decisions?
So reporting to members.
Reporting to members.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that's an open question, and it's given that we're at an ACSI conference, it's great to put it on the table. So I'd be very supportive of, I think more broadly, ACSI just this week have talked about the concept of stewardship amongst institutional investors more broadly, and I would certainly encourage members of the investment community to see what can be agreed to that end. Remembering, importantly, that one of the outcomes of the Financial Services Royal Commission was an ability for ASIC to approve codes and perhaps in future even make them enforceable.
I think, Michael, that transparency to members is very important. So our climate change adaptation plan is on our website. We report our proxy voting on our website. We report our engagement activities. So it's very important to communicate with members. What hasn't been mentioned to date is in the discussion is the pressure that comes from members to the fund in relation to acting on climate change risk. So we get a lot of pressure from our members, particularly amongst our members who work in health and education, who see the climate change risk as a huge moral imperative, and they are asking us to take it into account in our investment decision making. Whilst we have a responsible investing component, option in the fund, the pushback from our members, or I shouldn't say pushback, but the push from our members is to look across the whole fund and with those lenses of climate change risk. And there's often a debate about whether or not there should be divestment. That is part of the push that we get from members, and we've taken the view that in the first instance, engagement is the best way of effecting change. But nevertheless, we need to respond to what our members are saying to us, and we do respond.
Okay, I'll just add to that. I made a speech earlier in the year called the Climate Data Deficit, and that sort of highlighted this issue around the big next challenge is around data. And so governments, investors, regulators, the community can't make good decisions without good data. And given the nature of this risk, the unprecedented nature of this risk, and the fact that this risk is accelerating, the urgency around solving the data deficit as it relates to the management of the risk will require a multidisciplinary response. And so disclosure certainly helps. We have TCFD, which is a voluntary framework. How long that framework globally remains voluntary is a question mark. Some jurisdictions are changing their view on that. I think more data, more disclosure, better modelling, better capability is fundamental to the mitigation and management of the risk. And so, again, I'd encourage ACSI, your peers to work with, and get involved in these discussions, because I don't think any one sector, regulators, governments, investors have the answers. It's very multidisciplinary because it's so analytically complex to understand how this is going to play out.
And I think this discussion goes to the question, and you touched on it there, Geoff, is that will we see something like the TCFD or some kind of disclosure regime becoming mandatory? Because there's certainly been some signals internationally that perhaps that's the steps we need to take. We need to encourage more consistent adoption. Do you think we'll reach that stage?
Well, I think and John, fill in on this, the legal opinion and other obligations without that being, applies obligations without TCFD being mandatory. But John?
Look, I wouldn't like to speculate. I'd simply go back to my earlier point. Legal issues aside, I see the TCFD disclosure framework as becoming the de facto standard for disclosure in our market. So, and I think if that continues, that's a credit to the participants in our market. There can be a market-driven solution.
Great. I think we had one more question. We've got time for one more. I can't see beyond the...
Hi, Jodie Tapscott from Colonial First States. Question for John. To date, ASIC's focus in this space has been mainly on corporate activity. I'm curious as to what ASIC's views are on the requirements for responsible entities in the funds management space, and how RE boards are required to manage climate risk for unit holders.
Well, perhaps if I can broaden out that question to talk about where I think there is a challenge perhaps in the investment markets in Australia, and that is looking, and this is sort of a challenge right across the investment sector, because I think it is patchy. It's about looking at how to get beyond short-term financial analysis as the primary analysis in terms of investment decisions. So there are a couple of ways you can cut that. You can look at it from the point of view, well, how do you take into account things like non-financial risk? And that would, of course, include climate risk in making investment decisions. And over what time horizon are we really basing our investment decisions? Now, I think they are very difficult questions, but I think they're very important questions for the investment community to grapple with, because I think the views of the community are changing and expectations around asset managers and investors will change with them.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time. We're due to break now for morning tea, which is in Sophie's Lounge, and we're very grateful to our supporters for morning tea, MSCI. We're back at 11:20, which is for what's shaping up to be a very interesting directors panel. But in the meantime, please thank me for... Oh, sorry, not me. Please thank our panel, Rosemary Kelly, John Price and Geoff Summerhayes.